Behold, my glorious supporter Quartermaster Sea has requested some discussion about blue players in Magic the Gathering. Quartermaster Sea says, please help blue players salvage their honor as blue players by reminding them in true Zandy style that they have other tools at their disposal that are just as useful as counterspells, and that diversifying their toolkits will not only help them win more, but also keep non-blue players from getting too annoyed, and help them, like, have friends and stuff. Sure. Let's do a brief primer, as I like to do, on this topic in case people are not familiar. Magic the Gathering has a pretty prominent color pie, as we call it. There's blue, black, red, green, and white in that order. And these colors have different design space. So black is really good at killing stuff, surprise, necromancy, sacrificing resources to get a more powerful effect. Stuff like that. Green is good at growing things, which gives you like more mana to cast your spells. Really big creatures, maybe. Not that good at straight up killing stuff, unless it's with a creature. Like that. What you would expect, sort of. White is, sort of order focused. Red is chaos, impulse, and fire and lightning focused. Emotion, sort of. Blue is the color of wisdom, knowledge, control. And this makes blue a color for scumbags. No, I'm just kidding. But part of blue's design space is counterspelling. In Magic, when you cast the spell, and a spell would be pretty much anything, like summoning a creature, attempting to summon a creature, trying to bring forth an artifact, enchanting something with magic, or just throwing a fireball at someone. Almost everything in Magic is casting a spell. Even planeswalkers are you casting a spell to call forth your magicking ally to help you. So again, like pretty much everything is a spell. And blue has the ability to counter spells. In Magic, if you try to do basically anything, blue players have some cards that say, no, you don't do that thing. And if that sounds unfun, it can be. It's not as broken as it sounds. How it would feel is you're a blue player and I'm, not. I'm going to cast some proactive creatures or something and try to kill you. And you're a blue player. Well, if you think that I'm going to cast something that you're going to want to counter, you've got 3 mana or whatever, which a lot of counter spells cost like 3 mana, a pretty medium amount of mana. And you're going to have to leave that mana open. You're going to have to not spend it on your own, creature to attack me with or something. And you'll, draw for your turn and play a land and say, go ahead. I'll take my turn. And now, if I don't play something that you want to counter, you just gave up a lot of opportunity costs. You likely cannot easily play a creature or something to threaten me with. So it's not totally unfair or anything, but it can be frustrating because what you can do is save a spell that makes you, draw more cards, or maybe you can cast the creature, something with flash that can be played on my turn. And then you hold up mana. If I cast something good, you say no, you don't get that with a counterspell. And if I don't cast something good, maybe because I fear that you're going to counter it, then you just draw more cards or play your own creature anyway, causing you to have virtually no opportunity cost for holding up the counterspell. Again, depending on what format of Magic you play, depending on what cards you're playing or what kind of whatever you're using, this may not be possible, but it often is. And there is a common feeling with blue players that they get all the benefits of playing any other way, but they also just get to wait and see if they want to say no to you, which can feel really bad. And because counterspells are such a universal answer, balanced only by the fact that you have to get the spell right when it happens. Blue players often have this thing where they can counterspell whatever, and they can often bounce stuff, like return it to your hand. But once something is in play, a blue player can rarely simply destroy it. They have to either get it when it's coming out, they have to have that opportunity cost where they're ready when you're going to cast it, or they just have to stall you. They can maybe put it back to your hand, they can delay it or slow it down, but outright killing something, if you get it in play, blue players often can't do as much about that, which again is supposed to be why it's balanced. That was an interesting description of that. Even if you play a little Magic, that's what blue is supposed to be balanced around. But again, there can be this sort of opportunity cost. Now, there are a lot of weaknesses to counterspell strategies. It can often be a little slow. You're not going to have a lot of robust ways to deal with your opponent playing many small creatures. So if they can play a bunch of smaller threats, and they don't run out of cards from playing a bunch of smaller threats, you might be in trouble. You're not going to be able to counter them all without some bullshit, if we're going to be frank about it. It's, possible, but not likely. Additionally, there are cards you cannot counter, and your opponent may have a counterspell of their own to protect their own threat. It is a decent approach to play a medium-sized creature, knowing you're going to get countered, and then counter their counter and get your creature regardless. There are, and I think this is pretty fun, kind of like counterspell wars sometimes, where everyone at the table, or a lot of people at the table, have counterspells or know other people have counterspells. And there's maybe a turn or maybe even a few of people kind of being quiet, waiting, and then one person plays something and a crap ton of counterspells go off. And at the end, you have to go, okay, that one counters that one, that. Okay, it actually does come into play. And then someone's like, I do have a kill spell anyway, now that nobody has a counterspell to stop me. And that can be kind of fun. I think that sort of wizard poker aspect of Magic can be really interesting at medium to higher levels of play. But I do think it leads to the problem that Quartermaster Sea is describing, where blue players often are stereotyped or stereotype themselves into playing as though that's what blue does. Blue doesn't have any other options, and blue does have other options. So let's talk about them. Some strategies that are stereotypically blue are a tempo kind of strategy. Blue may often be able to construct a strategy where you use some counter magic and some bounce spells to put stuff temporarily away from the board, backed up alongside a really good or clever creature. Maybe they just have a few creatures, but this creature flies, they're evasive, or there has some other benefit. Maybe they have hexproof to protect themselves, something like that. And this creature will be a rather modest threat by itself, but because it's backed up by the blue player's other magic, it's going to be defended from outside threats while it gets in its, again, only modest size pokes. This can be a way to win that requires a lot of discipline, in that you have to be careful about what you stop your opponent from doing, and that can make counter magic much more interesting to play with. You don't just stop everything, and also a lot less frustrating to play with, to play against for your opponent, because you're not going to stop most of what they do. You're going to carefully stop the things you need to stop. That playstyle reminds me a lot of a common red playstyle where you have burn spells to do direct damage to things. And you would like to throw them all at your opponent's face, but it will be very important at a medium to high level of play to make sure that you don't use all of them on your opponent, and you do make sure to use them to kill some of your opponent's creatures, the ones that really matter, so your own creatures can keep getting in for damage. And a mark of a skilled, aggressive red player is often whether they use any of their burn spells on their opponent's creatures, and which ones. Like, they very judiciously, one time they do interact with their opponent, and that one time decides the entire game. It looks very simple to play, but actually requires a lot of discipline to choose when you do commit the resources to stop your opponent from doing something. And understanding how important the things your opponent is doing are or are not to their strategy can be manifested in blue as well, as long as you don't play a deck with literally all counterspell. Well, okay, anyway, mostly counterspells. A few counterspells can lead to a much more interesting and almost equally effective line of play that is simultaneously more proactive and less frustrating to play against. Try tempo. That being said, a lot of you watching play Magic the Gathering in multiplayer commander games with 3 other players, and it's very difficult to play a successful tempo strategy with multiple opponents, because one problem with tempo is you're often using your cards to trade. You lose cards, and you're only temporarily or at least trading for what your opponent has. So in the long term, they're going to win the war of attrition, but you're going to kill them before they can do that. You're going to slow them down so much that they die before they can use the resources that you're not really permanently getting rid of for them. You're burning your own resources to make them slower, so much slower that you can kill them. It's practically impossible in Magic to make 3 players simultaneously slow enough that you can kill all of them. That's simply going to take too long and too many resources most of the time. So that's one reason to consider not playing a pile of counterspells, because that's also not going to work. There's a huge opportunity cost. You will keep mana open to counter 1 spell, and your opponents will cast 3 spells. That math is not particularly working in your favor. So that's one thing as well. Again, there are ways to make it work, of course, but there is a good reason not to do it that way. So what are some strategies that work in multiplayer? Well, one of them is to bounce all of the things. Yes, you can kind of go in the opposite direction and slow everyone, including yourself, down to play a sort of temporary removal-based tempo. Wipe everything off the field, put it back in people's hands, and then focus on making yourself faster rather than your opponents slower. Another way this can be very effective is by using counterspells, again, more judiciously, to disrupt only the part of the plan that your opponents actually need after you see what that plan is. The board is full of stuff. You've got a bunch of dudes, they've got a bunch of dudes. Your one opponent has this big stack of cards where they got one creature that's enchanted with like 10 effects, and you play a spell that bounces everything back to everyone's hands. Now, in the long run, you have not yet accomplished anything, because those creatures are simply going to be played back onto the board. But now you know that that one player with the big buffed up creature, that player is going to need to deploy those spells in those order. And, oh, they had that one spell that was protecting it. If I can get rid of that spell, that makes the whole stack of cards fall apart. And then you know what to counter and you get some more information. That can be something. An interesting way to go can be to play your counterspells as creatures and bounce them yourself back to your hand. This is interesting because, you know, you're not playing quite as many counterspells. There just aren't that many creatures that qualify. And also because they are a threat. It removes the monotony of playing counterspells and kind of trying to make the game have nothing happen, because you are simultaneously playing an offensive threat, or at least potentially one. These creatures are really good for tempo strategies. There are, again, only a few of them because it's obviously very powerful. But when you only have a few of them, you need to be careful how you use them. I'm going to end the discussion about using counterspells, but just not so many here. But I do think there are ways to play with counterspells that are interesting and invite your opponents to play Magic the Gathering rather than just countering literally everything, which might eventually make you win. But if the goal of playing the game is to have fun, you can use counterspells effectively without doing that, and I am nearly certain that you and everybody else would find that more fun. So why not? For what it's worth, in my experience with Magic, it is not commonly a viable strategy to play a large number of counterspells in any format, but that doesn't stop people from trying to do it, you know. Anyway, moving on. Yeah, bounce spells. There's a lot of finesse with spells that simply return a creature to the hand, or in some way temporarily remove a creature. There's all sorts of shenanigans you can get up to there. You can wait for your opponents to target a creature with a spell, and then remove the creature so the spell fizzles, having no target. You can perhaps just bounce the spell, which can be a weird form of counter magic, but it's nice because it lets your opponent still have their fun. They just don't get to have it now, which is maybe less a bitter pill to swallow in my mind. Those spells are usually a little more fair, but still good. That is an approach, you know, bounce things at tactical times, bounce a lot of things at once and play your things out more quickly. Do that, you know, control the pace of the combat while letting people still do things. Abuse summoning sickness. When creatures come into play in Magic, they need a turn to recover from the impact of being brought into this world to fight for you, which is called summoning sickness, and it means they can't attack right away. You can wait a turn before bouncing them, meaning that they will be stalled much longer. You don't need to bounce, every turn. You can do every 2 turns and they'll still be unable to attack unless they have haste or something, which can be an interesting strategy. Again, against 3 players in a multiplayer game, maybe not, you know, efficient enough because you're going to need a lot of bounce spells, but, you know, sometimes it comes up. But more to the point, there's just a lot of interesting blue utility, and I think that that's what Quartermaster Sea wanted me to talk about. The reason I didn't start by discussing it that way is because I think it's important to to speak to the blue players, who are the people that Quartermaster Sea wants to influence here, and not immediately say, stop using the most powerful effect blue has, counter spells. I mean, that's arguable, but you get the point. No, I mean, okay, use them, but here are some suggestions for how to think about that differently. Now that I've gotten my foot in the door with those people, and they're hopefully, I hope you are, still listening to this video, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other directions to go in. Blue has a lot of basically removal that is like a polymorph effect. You turn something into something else, or freeze it, or just make it really weak for a long time or something. Transformative removal effects, which are, yeah, often not as powerful as straight up killing the thing, but they can be better in their own ways too. Your creature that is dead is in the graveyard. If you are a black player, you might have wanted the creature in the graveyard, so you can bring it right back. And having your creature alive but weakened is actually worse for some kinds of players than if it were dead. They could easily bring back a dead creature. They're planning for their creatures to die, but getting them debilitated or transformed, not so much. So that's one option. Blue also has a lot of clones, and you know it gets better if you have 3 other opponents, 3 players worth of creatures to pick from, a creature that can copy any creature in play, and blue has an awful lot of those. I have an entire deck that is like 75% clones, and the goal is, I have some good targets I want to copy, but the goal is to pick and choose the best pieces of the battlefield, and maybe even use some counter spells that I have in the deck to protect a creature for now, leading that player who owns that creature to maybe not attack me as readily, since I just protected their thing and might do so again in the future. They then use their good creature I protected to aggress my opponents, our mutual opponents, and then I clone their creature, kill them, and continue using their creature to kill their opponents, which can work out very well if you time it correctly and don't give away your poker face a little bit. It will be tactically advantageous for the player to not immediately kill you, and you will get to use their creature twice, once through them and once yourself. Clones are really good. Being able to transform creatures into other stuff also often results in the creature that you transformed mechanically being exiled, removed from the game, which can be a very powerful place to put that creature so it can't be easily resurrected. Other blue stuff. Yeah, I mean, blue also has a lot of surprisingly good ways to make tokens. You can flood the sky and play a go wide strategy with blue, even though it doesn't seem like that would be something blue would be good at. Making a ton of birds and just birding people is a surprisingly effective strategy when playing blue in multiplayer. Drawing a ton of cards is a niche that blue has, and cards in hand matters cards can be really interesting. Mill is a weird one. Milling in Magic is when you attack your opponent's deck, removing cards from the top of it, and if you run out of cards in your deck and must draw, you lose, representing your mind having been torn to shreds and you being unable to produce more thought because your mind has been so thoroughly damaged. Your deck in Magic represents your spell book, the things you know, or the places you can recall, your mind. Mill in a multiplayer game can be tricky for the same reason that counterspells and stuff can be tricky, because you need to deal with 3 opponents. It's not as easy, you could kill them, there's 3 times as much health, but it doesn't really endanger them very much until you've destroyed their whole library. Now, if you're fighting 3 opponents, and the 4 of you all equally damage each other, most players kill other players by reducing their life total to 0. So you're helping each other kill each other, meaning that you don't need to kill all 3 players by yourself. Other players will be helping you out to kill each other. But it's rather unlikely that you have other players at the table that are trying to mill each other, meaning that you probably need to destroy all 3 players' decks pretty much all by yourself, which is not generally going to happen. It's possible, but again, a bit of a hard sell. But still, it can be useful to destroy or attack your opponent's decks when you play blue, especially when it's incremental. A really good strategy, at least in my experience when playing blue, is to do things to muck up the creature part of the board and leave some enchantments in play that slowly tick away at opponents' decks. My experience is that a lot of players will rightly recognize that if they leave that alone completely, it's going to take them out, but it's not convenient to just destroy it because it's not an immediate threat. What most people do in this situation is they rush. They start to attack each other more aggressively or play more aggressively, knowing that their deck is a more finite resource than it was before. And some players will find their strategy unexpectedly harangued by this. A player might have been drawing a ton of cards, for example, or before I mentioned players that will play many small creatures that replace themselves, a strategy that is unexpectedly much weaker if your deck is getting smaller, even if not by that much, and because that player drawing through their deck to replace the creatures they lost is thinning their own deck. Now they might have thought, okay, it should be big enough as long as I don't go crazy, but not if someone else is making it smaller, you know, that kind of thing. This can be an interesting approach. So that's not so bad. And tackling players in many different ways by, you know, milling a little here, a little there, or milling the player that is weak to it and not the others, can give you a good way that is hard to prevent to destroy that player without needing to damage their life total. This may also encourage your other opponents to attack each other, well, and you, but also each other, which can make it easier to kill them later. There's no point destroying that one player who's going to get milled out. Their life total is kind of irrelevant. They're going to die to decking themselves, so maybe people will look elsewhere. This might be more political than your community is, but I think you'll find that a lot of these politics or sort of group thinking interactions do come up as players get more experience with the game. And if you play with the same group a lot, you will notice people thinking about this stuff. It's not a matter of whether you play a political game or not. These are things that are objectively true in a strategic way, and it's a matter of whether players notice that they are true. If they don't, occasionally they can be worse, and I do think that blue has a weakness there. You want your opponents to be smart, because if they don't, then a lot of your strategizing may temporarily not work very well. Now, in the long term, it will still be wrong for those players to make that decision, even if they don't know why it's wrong, but they might not notice that it doesn't make sense to attack you and then kill you, which means you lost, That player will then die from making an incorrect decision, but it doesn't matter for you because you lost. My point is that that player may learn after that interaction that caused them to lose, and then in the future they will notice that there is strategic import to not immediately killing you, which will let you use these tactics to survive. So a word about politicking, because I do think it's a little bit more important for blue than certainly for some other colors. Green and black come to mind as colors that maybe don't care quite as much about politics most of the time. Anyway, a final note about blue, which is that I think blue has a lot of pretty interesting, I'm not going to say mini-game effects, but there are a lot of ways to transform the nature of combat in blue, or the nature of the game itself in blue. Tricky, somewhat chaotic spells that, unlike red chaos abilities, tend to be more controllable in some way. Maybe you build up a whole bunch of spells in an Eye of the Storm or something like that. That kind of mechanic in blue is often a little bit more predictable than it would be in red, a color all about having pure chaos on the field. And that can be an interesting way to play. I do think blue can be a pretty refreshing color because there are a lot of weird effects in blue. The way the game is balanced out, it's almost like blue is the color that magic itself is kind of core in, like casting spells. I don't mean magic the whole game. And so a lot of the weirdest effects are in blue. Doubling, copying spells is a part of blue that can be really mechanically interesting. One way to counterspell, it's not going to be very effective because casting 3 counterspells at once is often a waste. But if you don't play counterspells, you know what you can cash in on? Doubling spells, copying spells a lot. And blue is really good at that, along with red. That can be a really interesting approach with blue that strongly encourages you not to play too many counterspells, because it's usually not very powerful to copy a counterspell, unless you're trying to counter a counterspell. But anyway, you get the point. Playing your own counterspell and then copying it doesn't usually make sense. That's my point. So that is an elegant way to not play a ton of counterspells and get a lot of effectiveness from blue. Yeah, I play a lot of blue. I think it's hard to argue that blue is not objectively one of the more powerful colors. There are just a lot of really good effects in blue. Now, another way to put it is that in Magic overall, it's not usually very punishing to play 2 colors, and blue might not have very good creatures. You could argue that blue almost always has the worst creatures. I think that's fair. Although they are often evasive, they often have good abilities. They just don't have a lot of power. If you ultimately need to kill your opponent, blue probably gives you the worst way to hit your opponent for a large number. But blue gives you the best of everything else, literally everything else. So in a game where you can go ahead and have two colors, and every color other than blue is good at hitting your opponent for a lot of damage, it's very good to be a color that the only drawback is you don't have a good way to hit people, because you don't need it. You can just use anything else to hit them for a lot of damage. And blue's creatures are going to have the abilities, and blue as a color is going to have the spells, the other effects, everything but the damage to back that up. So it is a powerful color, but I think it's worth understanding that blue's strength is largely that its weakness is something that is easy to come by. Its strength isn't counterspells. Counterspells are good, but there's a lot of other stuff to check out in blue. I hope that was an interesting little dip. I'm by no means a professional Magic player, and I'm not going to have covered everything that blue can do, but I hope that that gave you some ideas for directions to take blue Magic that are not just a pile of counterspells, and maybe to consider that a pile of counterspells is actually sort of bad a lot of the time, and there are maybe more effective ways to enjoy a little counter magic as that fun gotcha or ace in the hole without annoying the rest of the table by preventing them from doing things, drawing the game out, and ultimately probably losing a good amount of the time anyway. So give it a go. I hope you have a good time with it. I know I do.